Section 7 of A Popular History of France, Volume 5. This recording is in the public domain. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 5, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 36. Henry IV, Catholic King, 1593 to 1610. Part 2. Henry IV, with his mind full of his new character as a Catholic king, perceived the necessity of getting the pope to confirm the absolution which had been given him at the time of his conversion by the French bishops. It was the condition of his credit amongst the numerous Catholic population who were inclined to rally to him, but required to know that he was at peace with the head of their church. He began by sending to Rome non-official agents, instructed to quietly sound the pope, amongst others Arnold d'Ossat, a learned professor in the University of Paris, who became at a later period the celebrated cardinal and diplomat of that name. Clement VIII. Hippolytus Aldobrandini was a clever man, moderate and prudent to the verge of timidity, and one who was disinclined to take decisive steps as to difficult questions or positions until they had been decided by events. He refused to have any communication with him who he still called the Prince of Bearn, and only received the agents of Henry IV. Privately in his closet. But whilst he was personally severe and exacting in his behavior to them, he had a hint given them by one of his confidants not to allow themselves to be rebuffed by any obstacle, for the pope would sooner or later welcome back the lost child who returned to him. At this report, and by the advice of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinand de' Medici, Henry IV. determined to send a solemn embassy to Rome, and to put it under the charge of a prince of Italian origin, Peter de Gonzaga, Duke of Nevers. But either through the pope's stubborn resolve or the ambassador's somewhat impatient temper, devoted as he was, however, to the Holy See, the embassy had no success. The Duke of Nevers could not obtain an official reception as ambassador of the King of France. It was in vain that he had 5 confidential audiences of the pope; in vain that he represented energetically to him all the progress Henry IV. Had already made, all the chances he had of definitive success, all the perils to which the papacy exposed itself by rejecting his advances. Clement VIII. Persisted in his determination. Philip II. and Mayenne still reigned in his ideas, and he dismissed the Duke of Nevers on the 13th of January, 1594, declaring once more that he refused to the Navarrese absolution at the inner bar of conscience, absolution at the outer bar, and confirmation in his kingship. Henry IV. did not put himself out, did not give himself the pleasure of testifying to Rome his discontent. He saw that he had not as yet sufficiently succeeded, sufficiently vanquished his enemies, or won to himself his kingdom with sufficient completeness and definitiveness, to make the pope feel bound to recognize and sanction his triumph. He set himself once more to work to grow still greater in France, and force the gates of Rome without its being possible to reproach him with violence or ill temper. He had been absolved and crowned at St. Denis by the bishops of France. He had not been anointed at Rheims, according to the religious traditions of the French monarchy. At Rheims he could not be, for it was still in the power of the League. Researches were made to discover whether the ceremony of anointment might take place elsewhere. Numerous instances were found, and in the case of famous kings. Pepin the Short had been anointed first of all at Mayence, Charlemagne and Louis the Debonair at Rome, Charles the Bald at Mayence, several emperors at Aix-la-Chapelle and at Cologne. The question of the holy phial, or ampoule, was also discussed, and it was proved that on several occasions other oils, held to be of miraculous origin, had been employed instead. These difficulties thus removed, the anointment of Henry IV. Took place at Chartres on the 27th of February, 1594. The Bishop of Chartres, Nicholas de Thou, officiated, and drew up a detailed account of all the ceremonies and all the rejoicings. 13 medals, each weighing 15 gold crowns, were struck, according to custom. They bore the king's image, and for legend, In via virtuti nulla est via, or To manly worth no road is inaccessible. Henry IV., on his knees before the grand altar, took the usual oath, the form of which was presented to him by Chancellor de Cheverny. With the exception of local accessories, which were acknowledged to be impossible and unnecessary, there was nothing wanting to this religious hallowing of his kingship. But one other thing, more important than the anointment at Chartres, was wanting. He did not possess the capital of his kingdom; the League were still masters of Paris. uneasy masters of their situation, but not so uneasy, however, as they ought to have been. The great leaders of the party, the Duke of Mayenne, his mother the Duchess of Nemours, his sister the Duchess of Montpensier, and the Duke of Feria, Spanish ambassador, were within its walls, a prey to alarm and discouragement. "At breakfast," said the Duchess of Montpensier, "they regale us with the surrender of a hamlet; at dinner, of a town; at supper, of a whole province." The Duchess of Nemours, who desired peace, exerted herself to convince her son of all their danger. "Set your affairs in order," she said; "if you do not begin to make your arrangements with the king before leaving Paris, you will lose this capital. I know that projects are already afoot for giving it up, and that those who can do it, and in whom you have most confidence, are accomplices and even authors of the plot." Mayenne himself did not hide from his confidants the gravity of the mischief and his own disquietude. "Not a day," he wrote on the 4th of February, 1594, to the Marquis of Montpezat, "but brings some trouble because of the people's yearning for repose, and of the weakness which is apparent on our side. I stem and stop this ferment with as much courage as I can; but the present mischief is overwhelming. The King of Navarre will in a few days have an army of 20,000 men, French as well as foreigners. What will become of us, if we have not wherewithal not only to oppose him, but to make him lose the campaign? I can tell you of a verity that, save for my presence, Paris would have already been lost because of the great factions there are in it, which I take all the pains in the world to disperse and break up, and also because of the small aid, or rather the gainsaying, I meet with from the ministers of the King of Spain." Mayenne tried to restore amongst the Leaguers both zeal and discipline. He convoked, on the 2d of March, a meeting of all that remained of the faction of the Sixteen. He calculated upon the presence of some 1,200. Scarcely 300 came. He had an harangue delivered to them by the Reverend John Boucher, charged them to be faithful to the old spirit of the League, promised them that he would himself be faithful even to death, and exhorted them to be obedient in everything to Brissac, whom he had just appointed governor of the city, and to the provost of tradesmen. On announcing to them his imminent departure for Soissons, to meet some auxiliary troops which were to be sent to him by the King of Spain, "I leave to you," he said, "what is dearest to me in the world, my wife, my children, my mother, and my sister." But when he did set out, 4 days afterwards, on the 6th of March, 1594, he took away his wife and his children. His mother had already warned him that Brissac was communicating secretly, by means of his cousin, Sieur de Rochepot, with the royalists, and that the provost of tradesmen, Huillier, and 3 of the 4 sheriffs were agreed to bring the city back to obedience to the king. When the Sixteen and their adherents saw Mayenne departing with his wife and children, great were their alarm and wrath. A large band, with the incumbent of St. Cosmo (Hamilton) at their head, rushed about the streets in arms, saying, "Look to your city; the policists are brewing a terrible business for it." Others, more violent, cried, "To arms! Down upon the policists! Begin! Let us make an end of it!" The policists, that is, the burgesses inclined to peace, repaired on their side to the provost of tradesmen to ask for his authority to assemble at the palace or the Hotel de Ville, and to provide for security in case of any public calamity. The provost tried to elude their entreaties by pleading that the Duke of Mayenne would think ill of their assembling. "Then you are not the tradesmen's, but M. de Mayenne's provost?" said one of them. "I am no Spaniard," answered the provost; "no more is M. de Mayenne. I am anxious to reconcile you to the Sixteen." "We are honest folks, not branded and defamed like the Sixteen; we will have no reconciliation with the wretches." The Parliament grew excited, and exclaimed against the insolence and the menaces of the Sixteen. "We must give place to these sedition mongers, or put them down." A decree, published by sound of trumpet, on the 14th of March, 1594, throughout the whole city, prohibited the Sixteen and their partisans from assembling, on pain of death. That same day, Count de Brissac, governor of Paris, had an interview at the Abbey of St. Anthony with his brother in law Francis d'Epinay, Lord of St. Luc, Henry IV.'s Grand Master of the Ordnance. They had disputes touching private interests, which they wished, they said, to put right; and on this pretext advocates had appeared at their interview. They spent 3 hours in personal conference, their minds being directed solely to the means of putting the king into possession of Paris. They separated in apparent dudgeon. Brissac went to call upon the legate Gaetani, and begged him to excuse the error he had committed in communicating with a heretic. His interest in the private affairs in question was too great, he said, for him to neglect it. The legate excused him graciously, whilst praising him for his modest conduct, and related the incident to the Duke of Feria, the Spanish ambassador. "He is a good fellow, M. de Brissac," said the ambassador; "I have always found him so. You have only to employ the Jesuits to make him do all you please. He takes little notice otherwise of affairs. One day, when we were holding council in here, whilst we were deliberating, he was amusing himself by catching flies." For 4 days the population of Paris was occupied with a solemn procession in honor of Saint Genevieve, in which the Parliament and all the municipal authorities took part. Brissac had agreed with his brother in law d'Epinay that he would let the king in on the 22d of March, and he had arranged, in concert with the provost of tradesmen, 2 sheriffs, and several district captains, the course of procedure. On the 21st of March, in the evening, some Leaguers paid him a visit, and spoke to him warmly about the rumors current on the subject in the city, calling upon him to look to it. "I have received the same notice," said Brissac, coolly, "and I have given all the necessary orders. Leave me to act, and keep you quiet, so as not to wake up those who will have to be secured. To morrow morning you will see a fine to do and the policists much surprised." During all the first part of the night between the 21st and 22d of March, Brissac went his rounds of the city, and the guards he had posted, "with an appearance of great care and solicitude." He had some trouble to get rid of certain Spanish officers, "whom the Duke of Feria had sent him to keep company in his rounds, with orders to throw themselves upon him and kill him at the first suspicious movement; but they saw nothing to confirm their suspicions, and at 2 A.M. Brissac brought them back much fatigued to the duke's, where he left them." Henry IV., having started on the 21st of March from Senlis, where he had mustered his troops, and arrived about midnight at St. Denis, immediately began his march to Paris. The night was dark and stormy, thunder rumbled, rain fell heavily, the king was a little behind time. At 3 A.M. the policists inside Paris had taken arms and repaired to the posts that had been assigned to them. Brissac had placed a guard close to the quarters of the Spanish ambassador, and ordered the men to fire on any who attempted to leave. He had then gone in person, with L'Huillier, the provost of tradesmen, to the New Gate, which he had caused to be unlocked and guarded. Sheriff Langlois had done the same at the gate of St. Denis. On the 22d of March, at 4 A.M., the king had not yet appeared before the ramparts, nor any one for him. Langlois issued from the gate, went some little distance to look out, and came in again, more and more impatient. At last, between 4 and 5 o'clock, a detachment of the royal troops, commanded by Vitry, appeared before the gate of St. Denis, which was instantly opened. Brissac's brother in law, St. Luc, arrived about the same time at the New Gate, with a considerable force. The king's troops entered Paris. They occupied the different districts, and met with no show of resistance but at the quay of l'Ecole, where an outpost of lanzknechts tried to stop them. But they were cut in pieces or hurled into the river. Between 5 and 6 o'clock, Henry IV., at the head of the last division, crossed the drawbridge of the New Gate. Brissac, Provost L'Huillier, the sheriffs, and several companies of burgesses advanced to meet him. The king embraced Brissac, throwing his own white scarf round his neck, and addressing him as marshal. "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's," said Brissac, as he called upon the provost of tradesmen to present to the king the keys of the city. "Yes," said L'Huillier, "render them, not sell them." The king went forward with his train, going along Rue Saint Honore to the Market of the Innocents and the Bridge of Notre Dame. The crowd increased at every step. "Let them come near," said Henry; "they hunger to see a king." At every step, too, at sight of the smallest incident, the character of Henry, his natural, thoughtful, and lovable kindliness, shone forth. He asked if his entry had met with resistance anywhere, and he was told that about 50 lanzknechts had been killed at the quay of l'Ecole. "I would willingly give 50,000 crowns," said he, "to be able to say that I took Paris without costing the life of one single man." As he marched along the Rue Saint Honoré, he saw a soldier taking some bread by force from a baker's. He rushed at him, and would have struck him with his sword. As he passed in front of the Innocents, he saw at a window a man who was looking at him, and pointedly keeping his hat on. The man perceived that the king observed him, and withdrew, shutting down the window. Henry said, "Let nobody enter this house to vex or molest any one in it." He arrived in front of Notre Dame, followed by 500 or 600 men at arms, who trailed their pikes, "in token of a victory that was voluntary on the people's part," it was said. There was no uproar, or any hostile movement, save on the left bank of the Seine, in the University quarter, where the 16 attempted to assemble their partisans round the gate of St. Jacques; but they were promptly dispersed by the people as well as by the royal troops. On leaving Notre Dame, Henry repaired to the Louvre, where he installed royalty once more. At 10 o'clock he was master of the whole city. The districts of Saint Martin, of the Temple, and Saint Anthony alone remained still in the power of 3,000 Spanish soldiers under the orders of their leaders, the Duke of Feria and Don Diego d'Ibarra. Nothing would have been easier for Henry than to have had them driven out by his own troops and the people of Paris, who wanted to finish the day's work by exterminating the foreigners; but he was too judicious and too far sighted to embitter the general animosity by pushing his victory beyond what was necessary. He sent word to the Spaniards that they must not move from their quarters, and must leave Paris during the day, at the same time promising not to bear arms any more against him in France. They eagerly accepted these conditions. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, ambassador, officers, and soldiers all evacuated Paris, and set out for the Low Countries. The king, posted at a window over the gate of St. Denis, witnessed their departure. They, as they passed, saluted him respectfully; and he returned their salute, saying, "Go, gentlemen, and commend me to your master, but return no more." After his conversion to Catholicism, the capture of Paris was the most decisive of the issues which made Henry IV. Really King of France. The submission of Rouen followed almost immediately upon that of Paris; and the year 1594 brought Henry a series of successes, military and civil, which changed very much to his advantage the position of the kingship as well as the general condition of the kingdom. In Normandy, in Picardy, in Champagne, in Anjou, in Poitou, in Brittany, in Orleanness, in Auvergne, a multitude of important towns, Havre, Honfleur, Abbeville, Amiens, Perronnu, Montdidier, Poitiers, Orleans, Rheims, Chateau Thierry, Beauvais, Sens, Riom, Morlèche, Laval, Laon, returned to the king's authority; some after sieges, and others by pacific and personal arrangement, more or less burdensome for the public treasury, but very effective in promoting the unity of the nation and of the monarchy. In the table drawn up by Sully of expenses under that head, he estimated them at 32,142,981 livres, equivalent at the present day, says M. Poirson, to 118 millions of francs. The rendition of Paris, "on account of M. de Brissac, the city itself and other individuals employed on his treaty," figures in this sum total at 1,645,400 livres. Territorial acquisitions were not the only political conquests of this epoch. Some of the great institutions which had been disjointed by the religious wars, for instance, the Parliaments of Paris and Normandy, recovered their unity and resumed their efficacy to the advantage of order, of the monarchy, and of national independence. Their decrees against the League contributed powerfully to its downfall. Henry IV. did his share in other ways besides warfare. He excelled in the art of winning over or embarrassing his vanquished foes. After the submission of Paris, the two princes of the house of Lorraine who had remained there, the Duchesses of Nemours and of Montpensier, one the mother and the other the sister of the Duke of Mayenne, were preparing to go and render homage to the conqueror. Henry anticipated them and paid them the first visit. As he was passing through a room where hung a portrait of Henry de Guise, he halted and saluted it very courteously. The Duchess of Montpensier, who had so often execrated him, did not hesitate to express her regret that "her brother Mayenne had not been there to let down for him the drawbridge of the gate by which he had entered Paris." "Ventre Saint Gris," said the king, "he might have made me wait a long while; I should not have arrived so early." He knew that the Duchess of Nemours had desired peace; and when she allowed some signs of vexation to peep out at her not having been able to bring her sons and grandsons to that determination, "Madame," said he, "there is still time, if they please." At the close of 1594, he imported disorganization into the household of Lorraine by offering the government of Provence to the young Duke Charles of Guise, son of the Balafres, who eagerly accepted it; and he, from that moment, paved the way, by the agency of President Jeannin, for his reconciliation with Mayenne, which he brought to accomplishment at the end of 1595. Section 8.